Hello and welcome. Now, the name Simple Deform Modifier might seem rather paradoxical because of some of the difficulties people tend to experience with it. But once you come to understand how to use it, you find that it is actually simple. And the name Simple Deform Modifier is quite apt. So let's get to it. Now, we will not need the camera or the light for this tutorial, so I will go ahead and hide them. First, we'll scale this cube down to the size we need. SY to scale on the y-axis, SX to scale on the x-axis, and SZ to scale on the z-axis. I'll add a subdivision surface modifier by clicking on the wrench icon, clicking on the arrow to scroll down. I am using Blender 3.4.1 by the way. So if everything on your screen does not look exactly like mine, it's probably because you are using a different version of Blender. Then I'll increase the levels to 5. Change to simple. And now I'll add an empty. I like this sphere because we're going to need to be doing some turning. For the deform to work properly, the empty must be located right in the middle of the mesh to be deformed. So make sure you don't move the empty after you add it. Now we will select the mesh and minimize the subdivision surface modifier just to get it out of the way. And now we'll add the simple deform modifier itself. We'll change to bend. And then select, we can bend it on any axis, but we'll start with the y-axis. And then we'll select the empty as our origin. Let us spin the mesh around so we can see what we are doing more clearly. We want to curl the mesh around the y-axis. So we want to sort of make the mesh bend around the y-axis like that. Sort of curl around it like a tube. So let's start with 0. Let's enter 0 into the angle box. And the mesh goes flat. Then better yet, let's switch to the y-axis. Move the angle slider until you see a taper. You will see the mesh taper slightly. Okay, that is fine. Just leave that alone. Now what we need to do is select the empty and spin the empty on the same axis that we are trying to bend the mesh on. So we're trying to bend it on the y-axis. So spin the empty on the y-axis. So rotate on the y-axis. Press arrow, then press Y to rotate on the y-axis. As you spin the empty, you will notice a perceptible bending along the y-axis. Now, if that is not the direction in which you want it to bend, all you have to do is rotate the empty in the other direction. You will see this perceptible bending. Once you notice this bending, leave the empty alone. Click on the mesh again to take us back to the modifier and move the degree, increase the degrees, or increase the angles rather. You will see the bending more, decisively this time, but getting rather distorted. This is where you go back to the empty, arrow Y, and then as you rotate the empty, rotate it in whatever direction removes the distortion. If you rotate it one way and it appears to increase the distortion, rotate it the other way. And it will straighten it out. It will make it look like the normal mesh. How do you know when it's accurate, when the proportions are right? Click on N and then look at the rotation values for the axis we are trying to bend the mesh on. Now we are in the empty now, don't forget that, be mindful of that. Look at the angle for the axis we are trying to bend the mesh on. It's usually a multiple of 90. Sometimes maybe 45 degrees, I'm not sure, but it's usually a multiple of 90. So as you can see, it's negative 81. So let's type in negative 90 degrees and see what we have. And you can see that the mesh now has the same the dimensions we had when we started out. If you zoom in, let's hide this. Let's press N to hide that again. If you zoom in, you can see that it's symmetrically bent around the y-axis. You can see the tip here touching the grid here, and you can see the tip touching the grid here on this side, symmetrically bent around the y-axis. And at this point, it's that's essentially all our little mesh wrote. All we have to do now is just increase the degrees on in a modifier box until the mesh bends completely around and gives us 360 beautiful degrees. There we are. There's our mesh completely bent into a tube. I will quickly show you a practical application where you can use the simple deform modifier. I will texture the interior of a tube, like the kind of tube you would use for a subway train station, which happens to be a project I am working on at the moment. So here goes. Add a cube and scale it like we did before. Scale on the y-axis, scale on the x-axis, and scale on the z-axis. Then we'll add an empty, the same sphere we used before. Now we need to apply a texture to one face of the mesh, the face of the mesh that will form the interior of the tube after we bend it. So I'm going to go into edit mode, select face, select option. So with the top face of our mesh selected, I'll switch to the shading workspace. What we are going to do is add a brick texture to the top face that we selected. Now there's a little thing about working with materials in Blender I don't understand. Now as you can see here, we already have a principled BSDF shader, but if I went ahead and tried to apply a texture to the surface of this mesh, the surface we selected, it will instead apply the texture to the entire mesh, which is of course not what I want. What usually works is adding another principled BSDF shader, adding another one, or adding another shader. Now, when I go ahead and apply the texture, it will, in fact, only adhere to the top surface, the surface that we selected. Why it doesn't work with the first shader that was automatically attached to the mesh when we changed to the shading workspace, I don't know. It's just a little thing. I don't know if it's a quirk. I don't know whether to call it a quirk, but I just find that when I use another shader, it gives me what I want. So what I'll go ahead and do now is create another shader. It will give me another principled BSDF shader. I'll press Ctrl plus spacebar to maximize the node editor. In Blender, if you wish to maximize any editor or any panel, just press Ctrl plus spacebar. To return to viewing all the panels on editors again, just press Ctrl plus spacebar again. Just make sure your mouse pointer is hovering over any panel or any editor you wish to maximize, and press Ctrl plus spacebar. So now let's maximize our node editor window again. Move this a little bit to the right to see things more clearly, and we'll add a brick texture node. Connect the color socket of the brick texture node to the color input of the principled BSDF shader. Ctrl plus spacebar to return to our previous screen. Then we'll click Assign. And when we click Assign, the brick texture will be applied to the top surface of our mesh. This is exactly what we want. So now we'll go back to Layout View. We'll switch to Material Preview to see the brick texture. And there we go. And I'll bend the mesh using the simple deform modifier like I did before. I won't explain the steps this time because I've already gone over that. So I'll just go ahead and bend the mesh into a tube. Now, it's important to say this time as we are bending, we definitely want to make sure we bend it up. We want to bend it in a direction that will ensure that the texture remains inside, not outside the tube. So this time we don't have a choice as to what direction we bend it. We definitely have to bend it up, not down this time. So select the mesh, bend it a little bit more. And there we go. There's our tube completely created. And just grab it and move it a little bit, and we can see the interior of our tube perfectly textured. This will make for a great tunnel for a subway station. This is in fact how I'm going to texture the tunnel of the subway station that I am modeling. Thank you for watching, and as always, like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.